And so we decided to shoot some off. It was about 9:20 or so at night, shooting them off, having a great time. Nephew's having a great time. Son's having a great time. My brother's having a great time. Woody, most of you know him from the show. Just enjoying the night, having a great time. And then the cops show up. Apparently, in Washington State, you can't shoot fireworks off unless it's July 4th, and only from 9 a.m. until midnight. And next year, you can't shoot any fireworks off, period. So we're told. And the cop was okay, you know, I mean, it was like dealing with any other cop. I mean, he was okay, I guess. I know Woody wasn't taken too kindly to the cop. It kind of went down like this.
Wide herb, huh? Heard of you.
Listen now, Mr. Kansas law dog. Law don't go around here. Savvy?
I'm retired.
Good. That's real good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real good, law dog, because law just don't go around here.
Yeah, I heard you the first time.
There it is. That was our first fireworks show for, I know, Woody's son, and my son was looking forward to it. And, you know, it's kind of frustrating. It's like, really, next year we can't shoot any fireworks off? Kind of ironic you're celebrating Independence Day and being shut down by law enforcement. There's some strange irony to that. But anyway, I guess he was just doing his job. You know, I can't beat the cop up too much for it, but you know, around the neighborhood, it was like fireworks are going off everywhere. It's like, really? You're going to go around all night long and shut people off from shooting fireworks off? Come on. You know, if it was 3 in the morning, I'd understand. If it was even midnight or 11:30 at night, I would completely understand. But really, I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm bent out of shape. How's your 4th of July weekend going? I hope it's going better than mine. Got a great show planned for you tonight. Going to be speaking with Jimmy, and Jimmy had a very interesting encounter while he was out hunting. We'll jump into that here in a moment. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out the website, sasquatchchronicles.com. Get additional shows. I know there's a Conspiracy Corner show I'm working on right now. Duke and I did yesterday about giants roaming the earth. So the conspiracy shows are kind of cool. They're outside of Bigfoot, but it's still interesting topics, or at least stuff I find interesting. I hope you do too. Again, if you've seen anything strange out there, please email me, wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Well, let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Jimmy to the show. Jimmy, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate you being here tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. If you would, kind of start from the beginning for the audience. I know you had 2 encounters. Let's kind of start with the first one. For the audience, tell us what you were out doing. Tell us what you ran into and what you experienced.
All right. It was hunting season, probably late October, early November. And I was out with my dad, and he dropped me off on this ridge. Stopped in the road. I walked up to the top of this ridge, and he was going to drive around, come down on the other side of the mountain, way down below, and try to push something up to me. And so I got up to the top, walked over, looked over the edge, you know, through the draw on the other side, found me a nice place to sit down. And sit down about 15, 20 minutes, you know, watching and listening. Heard something down in the draw and stood up. And then all of a sudden it sounded like a freight train was coming up that draw. And probably 5-10 seconds, not very long, a bull elk comes blowing up over top of the ridge and runs right past me. Not a mature bull elk, just a spike, probably his second year, probably a 2-year-old spike bull. And I thought that was weird. It freaked me out because he'd run right past me. He bounded down the hill, crossed the road, and took off. And I heard something else behind me because I was watching the bull elk as he was leaving. And there's this this thing, huge, massive creature chasing after that bull elk. And when it got to the top of the ridge, it put on its brakes and stopped and stared at me. Sorry, hold on just a second. It really freaked me out. This thing was, mercy. If it was an inch tall, it was 10 foot. And it had to be a minimum of 650, 700 pounds, just huge, hair-covered creature. And it stared at me. I stared at it. I was so scared I couldn't move. And I noticed in its right hand, it had a rock. And I think that I interrupted its hunt. And we stared at each other for a few seconds. I don't know if I said anything or not. I think I was probably too scared to. And after a couple of seconds, it lifted its hand that had the rock in it straight out to its side and kind of pushed the rock away, just got rid of it. And it turned around. It made two fists as it turned around and screamed and then walked back down the draw. And the impression I got was that roar that vibrated in my chest was a frustrated roar because I had interrupted its hunt. That's the impression that I got from that situation.
I'd imagine it was pissed. Can you describe for the audience what you actually saw?
All right. Well, I listened to your show quite a bit, and there was nothing about it other than the hair that made me think gorilla. It looked like just an enormous man, disproportionate, but the face looked more human than it did gorilla to me. Kind of like a receding hairline. Its head was set farther down in its shoulders. The length of its arms from its elbow to its fingertips seemed to be longer than its upper arm. Covered in kind of a dark charcoal gray with some tinge of brown to it, kind of brown charcoal. Probably 3-4 inches of hair everywhere. But like I said, it had kind of a receding hairline, big, dark eyes, and just massive, like, the physique of a bodybuilder, but bigger. Just, and where it was standing, I didn't see from the knees down because it didn't come all the way up to the top of that ridge. But from where it was standing, what I could see was from the knees up, it was still towering way over me. Probably 2 to 3 feet of it and it was still taller than me.
Did you notice any major facial features before it turned and screamed at you, or screamed away in frustration? When you were looking at the face of it, was there anything that stood out to you?
What stood out is how human it looked. It didn't have the low slung jaw like a chimpanzee. It had looked like a boxer's nose, a boxer that's had his nose broke several times, like a boxer's nose. And the eyes, it looked like they were, looking through me. The eyes were extremely intense.
How close were you to the creature?
Maybe 20, 25 yards.
Oh, wow. So you were really close.
Yeah.
What was it about the eyes?
I don't know. Just how intense its gaze was when it stared at me. I don't remember seeing any whites, just big, dark eyes.
I'm curious, did the expression change on the face? Was there any expressions you noticed?
Yeah, like right before it turned around, like a sigh, like pardon me, but it's like, damn it. You know, that from being focused on something where you're intent on doing something and then something interrupts you and you think, shoot, you know, that it changed from being intent on accomplishing a task to frustration. If that makes sense. And then when it turned around and let out that roar, and, you know, I could feel my organs vibrate. It was just deafening.
Yeah, I would imagine. That would have scared the hell out of me. At least it turned and went the other way out of frustration. It probably figured you were going to shoot at it.
Yeah. Well, I did have my rifle. I did not put my rifle up to my shoulder. It was laying in the crook of my left arm. And, you know, not having, you know, whites of the eyes to tell exactly where it's looking. I could, you know, it's looking at me, but I don't think I realized whether it looked down and saw my rifle or if I'm sure it saw it, but I don't know if that helped the situation. It seeing my rifle. I'm sure they know what a rifle is. But if this thing wanted to either chuck that rock at me or come after me, I don't think I would have had time to put my rifle up to my shoulder and get a shot off.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. It's interesting that you caught one in mid-hunt, hunting a bull elk down. I bet that bull elk was running for its life.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and, you know, if you see an elk in the wild and it comes up and it sees you, it's not going to run right past you. It's going to take off another direction. And that thing run right past me, didn't even care that I was there.
Yeah, you were probably the lesser of two evils in that situation.
Yep.
You know, probably figured it'd take its chances with you. And I've heard that from hunters before. You know, I've talked to a lot of hunters that have had deer and elk run right past them, and then all of a sudden they run into the creature or what they, you know, perceive to be a creature coming in and stopping at the tree line where they're at. And I think with these prey like deer and elk and all these other things, I really think we're the lesser of two evils. They'll take our chances with us, even if we're armed and everything else.
As I thought about it later, what I thought is, animals are a lot more intelligent than people give them credit for. I think that elk intentionally put me between it and the creature. I think that's why it came right over by me, because when it passed me, I don't know if I'm thinking too much about that, but I tend to think that elk decided to put me between itself and the creature.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. And so it's interesting. So the creature had a rock in its hand, and when it threw the rock off, and this is going to seem like an odd question, but it's more or less for myself. When it threw the rock off, did it throw it overhanded? Did it throw it sidearm? Did it just kind of drop it? Well, how did it throw the rock off?
Well, when I saw it, it was kind of hanging down at its side. When it got rid of the rock, it lifted its arm up straight out to its side. I don't know what the purpose was, but you know how if you have something and you just kind of push it, roll it off your fingertips and just push it out to the side. He didn't throw it. He didn't throw it overhand or sidearm. He just lifted it up and then pushed it away with his fingers. But it didn't just go 2 or 3 feet. It flew away from him. Does that make any sense? I mean, he held it up and then, you know, with a flick of the wrist, got rid of it. But this rock flew 40, 50 feet away.
Yeah, that does make sense. And that's kind of the why I asked you that is I've talked to a lot of people who said when they throw the rock, in your situation it's different. It sounds like he was just getting rid of the rock. But in some situations I've spoken to witnesses who've seen him throw rocks, and they say, you know, they don't throw them like people. They don't throw them overhanded like a person would. It's kind of sidearmed. It's kind of almost like if you ever watch a gorilla or a chimp throw a rock or throw something at you, there's a particular way that they throw it, and that's kind of why I asked. It turns around. You said it threw its hands in the air and then roared?
Well, it like clenched its fist, you know, after it got rid of the rock and turned around. It like if you tense up your whole body and scream in frustration. That's kind of the move it made. Like, making a fist and just clenching everything up and screaming.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the creature turns around, it exits, and what did you do next?
I walked down to the road and started walking in the direction I knew my dad would be coming back up when he came around.
At the time, did you know what it was?
I didn't. It's like when I heard your story, all I could think was monster. And after thinking about it, it was probably another hour or so until my dad came back. And then I started thinking about, there was an old man in the town that said that a Sasquatch had pushed a tree over on him, and everybody in town made fun of him. And then while I had that time to think, that's when I thought, I wonder if that's what it is. I bet that's a Bigfoot. I bet that's a Sasquatch. But when it happened, all I could think was monster. But as I had the time to sit there on top of that mountain and think, first thing I thought of was the old man that had said that a Sasquatch had pushed a tree over on him or at him. But I still, that's what I thought it possibly was, but I still wasn't sure. If it was a Bigfoot, I wasn't going to say anything about it because I knew that the way back then you were treated, if you said you saw a Bigfoot, you were a kook. And your life would basically be over. I mean, everybody in, small town mentality. So at that point, I just chose not to say anything about it. It wasn't until after listening to your show that I finally, it's been within the last year that I told my wife briefly about it. And I mentioned it to my dad. I asked if he remembered that time that was at Moose Creek when he dropped me off. And I told him that all I told my dad was, I think I saw Bigfoot. It's when I first talked to you last night is the first time I ever tried to recount, exactly what happened. And like I told you earlier, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how shaken up I would be trying to, tell the whole story. I'd never tried to tell it before.
Yeah, it's terrifying because you do relive it. It's like you and I were just talking about before we went on air. I've told my story a million times, and each time you do relive it. I guess after so many times of telling it, you kind of become numb to it a little bit. But in your mind, it's like you can still see the pictures playing as you're telling it. And you're right. I mean, that's, thinking you saw a monster. I mean, that's what I said for the longest time. I thought it was a monster. I didn't know what it was that I ran into.
And, I've heard other people say it before, but it does. It changes everything. Your whole outlook. Knowing that something that is laughable, something that isn't supposed to exist, does exist. It changes you. And I've heard people say, do you believe in Bigfoot? And people say, yes, I believe. And there's the people that say, I don't believe in Bigfoot. I'm a knower. And I put myself in that category. I don't believe in Bigfoot. I know Bigfoot exists.
No, I can understand that. And you're right, it does change you. Every witness I've ever spoken with or had on the show, I can tell you it changes you. It definitely changes you. It changes your outlook on a lot of things. A lot of things that you'd probably call BS on. And then I'm talking about outside of Bigfoot. You start to realize, well, maybe people aren't lying. And I'm talking about outside of Bigfoot.
Exactly.
Just weird things, aliens, whatever. You start to realize after a while that maybe people aren't full of crap. Maybe there's the other things out there I don't know about that I used to call BS on. How many years later was it that you had your second encounter?
Probably 3 or 4. I know that first one, I had just got my hunting license. So it was I was either 14 or 15. And my second one I was older and I was able to go into the mountains. I'd able to camp by myself. I grew up in a small town, and I was, our closest McDonald's was 120 miles away, if that gives you an idea how small my town was. what we did for fun, me and my friends, was go in the mountains on our motorcycles. And I spent a lot of time in the mountains, all over. And I was probably 17 or 18 when my second one happened.
Well, tell us about that one. What happened with that encounter?
All right. Well, it was probably midsummer, and back then you couldn't go down to Bass Pro and buy you a tree stand. There were tree stands, but they were $1,000. What I did was go down to the Steel and Ranch Supply and buy some 1.5 foot long spikes, and we always had lumber 2x4s and such, and I would make 5 or 6 or 7 trips on my motorcycle up into the mountains where I'd found a spot in a tree, and I'd nail the spikes into the tree and build a permanent tree stand in a spot that I knew would be a good hunting area. And this is still in Idaho. I'd found a nice spot on the edge of the meadow, a really nice big Douglas fir tree. And I got my spikes in the tree and got the base started, and had my backpack. I had a jug of water, had my backpack with my snacks. I always had deer jerky. Every hunting season we'd turn at least one deer that my family had got would be turned into jerky. So we always had stuff for camping. And then I left my backpack hanging on a nail up, 30 feet up in the tree. And when I came back with another load of equipment, I couldn't take a whole lot because I was on a Yamaha 175. They had a milk crate bungee corded to the back fender. And I came back and my backpack was on the ground and everything that was to eat in it was gone. But there was stuff in there that, if somebody was going to get into my backpack, they would have just grabbed the whole backpack and took off, because, there was a knife in there. There was a few tools and, other stuff. I don't remember exactly, but all that was gone out of it was the food. But what I found weird is if it was a small animal or a cat, a bobcat or a mountain lion or even a bear, my backpack would have been destroyed, but it wasn't. It was unzipped. And that, confused me. Is either there's somebody up here, and where I had decided to put that tree stand was not easy to find. It was way back in there. There's probably about 2 miles on deer trails that I had to ride my motorcycle to get back to where I built that tree stand. And, I didn't think anything of it. It took me probably 2-3 days to build that tree stand, and twice, leaving if I left my backpack there and it had food in it, the food was gone when I came back on the next trip. And, I never thought to look for prints on the ground. I don't think I would have seen any anyway. It was, forest. It's Idaho, pine forest. There's probably 3 inches of pine needles on the ground at all times. But, I got that tree stand built, and then I didn't go back up there until hunting season. And then later that hunting season, I'd climbed up in my tree stand, and early in the morning, about an hour after the sun came up, the deer had come up the draw just like I thought they would from getting a drink down in the river. In the daytime, they'd go back up in the mountains, and I got a deer. And I, dressed it out, hung it in a tree, probably about 40, 50 yards away from the tree my stand was in. And I was it in the morning or evening? Anyway, whatever the case, after I got the deer gutted, I hung it in a tree, probably about 15, 20 feet up, and I decided to spend the night in my tree stand. I'd done it several times before, and in the middle of the night, I heard something. Something woke me up, and I saw something trying to get the deer that I had hanging in the tree. And what I saw looked very similar to my first encounter, just a lot smaller. I think it was a juvenile Sasquatch that was trying to get the deer that I had hanging. And just a side note, there was a rumor in town that some people from out of town had killed a large male and a female Sasquatch, early in the hunting season. And if that's the case, I think this might have been the offspring of the Sasquatches that were supposedly killed, because all I saw was this young one. I didn't see anything else other than this one. And it was making noise, grunting, and, trying to get my deer that I had hanging. And I, being half asleep, started yelling expletives at whoever was trying to get my deer first. My initial thought was that somebody was trying to steal my deer and didn't realize I was up there. It was later, after I, yelled at it a few times and started coming down, that it took off. And that's when I realized that, holy crap, that wasn't a person. That looked more like what I'd seen a couple of years before. Because it wasn't until it started running off that it got into the moonlight that I actually saw what it was. All I saw was a dark figure, because where it was hanging was in the trees, but it was a nice moonlit night. And as it took off running away from me is when I actually saw the creature when it got into the bright moonlight.
Can you describe what you saw?
That one looked more like a chimpanzee, but I think that is just because it was smaller. It was gangly. It wasn't, didn't look like a bodybuilder. That's what makes me think it was a juvenile. And I asked it, not knowing exactly, but I figured that thing was about my size. It looked more like a big chimpanzee, body-wise. I didn't get a good chance to see its face, being in the dark. I mainly saw it running away from me, and it did run away on all four. And that's what made me think it looked a lot like a chimp.
That's very interesting, because I actually spoke to a witness. I can't even tell you how many shows ago it was, but they were talking about seeing a very large bodybuilder gorilla / man on two legs walking upright. And then the witness had described seeing what appeared to be two very small chimpanzees on all fours following this gorilla, or what they described as a gorilla, in size and everything else. But it was interesting because he said they looked like two different, not completely two different creatures, but they had a different look. It was more gangly. I want to say that's the term he used. He said it just reminded him, it wasn't the monster bodybuilder type by any means. More like a teenager, like a teenager male before it grows into. Yeah, exactly. There's a difference between like a guy who's 28 years old and a guy who's 18 years old.
When you're that awkward,
right?
When you're nothing but knees and elbows and awkward, and you're in a big growth spurt and you look funny, that's what I think was going on with this one. It was in that awkward, prepubescent or right during puberty, when, in humans, when you've got that really awkward look.
It would still scare, it still worried the hell out of me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And when I, because I was half asleep, if I would have realized what it was, even though it wasn't a big old huge one, I would have never started down after the tree and yelling at it. If I would have realized, if I hadn't have been woken up and asleep, I probably would have let the thing take the deer. I don't think I would have came down after the tree, but what I was thinking was, there's some hillbilly up here trying to steal the deer that I just killed. That's what my sleepy mind was thinking, and I'm going to run him off. And I don't know how I was going to run him off, because I left my weapon up on my tree stand, and here I am down 30 feet below it.
Yeah, no, and I understand that. I mean, that would be the first logical thing that I think that would go through most people's mind. It's just interesting. And it's sad, that they shot and we don't have to go into that whole story, because I know there's more to the story and other people involved, so we don't have to go into that. But it's interesting, it's probably looking for easy food. I've heard of many encounters, especially when you look at historical accounts, a lot of the old trappers will talk about these things coming into your camp, raiding your backpacks, raiding your packs, taking food, and leaving in the middle of the night. And you're right, if it would have been a person, they would have just taken the whole backpack. Or they would have taken, the knife or the expensive stuff out of the bag. They wouldn't have bothered with the food.
Exactly. And, after I thought about it, and, at the time I wasn't thinking about what I had heard about the somebody killing a male and female one. I wasn't thinking about that. After that, I started, it's hard to explain. I started like, holy crap, these things are real and they have families. This was a child. And then I started feeling bad. I can't explain it, but does that make any sense? I started feeling bad for that young one.
No, it makes sense.
If it lost its parents, and, I couldn't imagine if you're out in the wild and you lose the people that take care of you. That's how I know it's I don't know. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt sorry for it.
No, I understand that. That makes sense. I think anyone with a heart, that would make sense too. It makes sense to me, even something, and that's kind of why I kind of used to struggle with hunting a lot, because I used to see the baby deers and I thought, man, you know what I mean? It's like, here I am. I'll just go down to the store and buy my beef. I mean, it sounds stupid, but I get what you're saying. You understand there's a family unit, and, if it would have been a person, it wouldn't have tried to take a whole deer out. You got to quarter those deers out. You got to pack them out. You don't just pick it up, throw it over your shoulder, and walk out with it. And so, a person just doesn't make sense in that situation. And I've heard of them, jacking deers out of the trees and taking them. I've talked to poachers and hunters who have shot deers and elk and said a gorilla showed up, threw it over its shoulder, and walked off with it. So they do that sort of thing.
And listening to, like, your show, I like listening to Bear and Coombo on the Bigfoot Outlaws, and, hearing similar type stories of the hunters, like Bear and Coombo say, if they hear a gunshot, that's like the dinner bell. They'll come and try to find what you shot and steal it from you. Found that out, but that's years later, listening to their show. But, it makes sense that, especially if this thing was all by itself, I imagine it was starving. If it isn't able to hunt yet, that was the idea I got, that this thing was hungry.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's not too far off. There's reports of grizzly bears stalking hunters here in the United States, and they wait for them to make a kill, and then they'll go in and take the kill. They're not necessarily stalking the hunters. They're just waiting for the gunshots to go off to go get the easy meal. And it would make sense that these things do the same thing.
Yep. I can see that. I've heard stories, and putting two and two together, somebody shooting a deer and it runs off, and they'd follow the blood trail till the blood trail stops. You can tell that it's gushing blood, and then it stops, and they can't ever find the deer again. And they think it's real well, it must have stopped bleeding. I used to think, it probably stopped bleeding. It probably died, 4 or 5 miles away. Now I think, you know what? Something probably picked that stinking deer up and run away with it. That's why you didn't find it. And that's why the blood trail stopped, is because something picked it up and absconded with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a hunter who shot a bull elk, a very large bull elk, and he said that he shot it in the throat, and it dropped not far off from where he had shot it. He walks up to it, puts another bullet in it just to make sure it's dead, had its eyes open, tongue out, and he goes, I heard it take its last breath, and this thing was dead. Had his dad wait behind. He goes to get his knife, comes back, and the whole bull elk's gone. He said there was no blood trail. It's like something just picked it up and walked off with it. And it's interesting, prior to that happening to him, he was getting rocks thrown at him, and he couldn't figure out where the rocks were coming from. And so I think you're right. I think that an easy meal is an easy meal. Yeah, especially if you're hanging a deer up like you were. It's easy pickings for these things.
Be as cautious as they are. I think the hunger, it had to know that I was there. I'm sure that it had watched me all day, but the hunger is what I think pushed it to try to come in and take that from me after I fell asleep.
Did you ever give up hunting after this?
No, I didn't. I hunted quite a few years. Actually, even after I moved away from my hometown, I'd come back during hunting season. Actually, I'd bring friends with me from out of town because the hunting back there was in my hometown was so good. You know, being in this, I would tell people, you know, when I lived in Colorado, I told my friends, you know, the elk out here are small in Colorado. Said the elk in Colorado are the size of our mule deer in Idaho. And that they'd call BS on me. And I said, well, I'll prove it this hunting season. We would go back to Idaho and prove it. Our mule deer are the size of elk most of the states. And our elk are huge.
Yeah.
But, you know, the whole center of that state of Idaho is primitive area. There's no roads, no motorized vehicles, you know. I think it's either 2.5 million or 3 million square miles of primitive area. And so there's, you know, there's camps back there and people can jet boat up the river or fly in. There's a couple of flying ranches back there. I used to work at one of them when I was younger. But, you know, for the most part, the animals have no pressure back there. Humans can't get to them. So they do have a chance to get a lot bigger. And that's why I think also the first one that I saw was as big as it was because the food sources back there are so plentiful. Maybe that was just my thought on why, you know, I've heard people say they were, you know, 6 to 7 or 7 to 8 feet tall. And this thing, the first one I saw, like I told you, if it was an inch tall, it was 10 foot at the very least. And a minimum of 650, probably more. This thing was just massive.
Yeah, no, I believe you. And you got a good look at that first one. If someone were to ask you what you thought Bigfoot was, what would you say to them? And there's no wrong answer.
You know, from my Native American heritage, I would have to go with it's not human, but it's another type of people. I personally do not think ape. I think maybe a primitive type of human or maybe not human, primitive type of people. But like I said earlier, there was nothing that I saw that suggested ape to me other than the hair, but nothing about its features. You know, I know the proportions were wrong, kind of like a gorilla's are, but that's not what I saw. You know, I don't know how to explain it, but what I saw was more human to me. I might be wrong, but that's just my opinion.
No, I understand that. I mean, I get what you're saying on that. And you're right. I mean, I've talked to a lot of hunters who've had them in their scope. And, you know, they could have easily pulled the trigger and hit him with the headshot. And a lot of times you ask hunters why they didn't shoot it, and they'll say, well, it kind of reminded me of a person. I didn't, there was something about it where I couldn't pull the trigger. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. There was just something odd about it. So I understand that. Like I said, there's no wrong answer. You know, we can only go off of what we've experienced. You know, you get down south, and they'll tell you that it's a overgrown chimpanzee. You know, you get up, you know, in different areas, and they'll describe them different ways, and we can only go off of our own experiences. But, you know, I do hear that a lot from people. When they see these things, they're like, hey, man, it reminded me more of a person than it did really an animal, just the way it acted. And it's interesting in your encounter, that frustration, that hot temper of tossing the rock and just being completely frustrated as it walked off that you screwed up its hunt, or its impression was that you screwed up its hunt.
Then that's what makes me think more a type of person, because it showed human type emotion, the frustration. You know, you would have had to seen it. It's like, you know, I don't want to say that that, just think when something has ticked you off so bad that you've just got to scream and walk away from it. That's the exact type of emotion that I saw. It was frustration. I mean, exactly. Just if something had screwed me up like that, I would be frustrated also. And that's what I saw, was that human type emotion. And that's what makes me think, if it was a gorilla or an ape, I don't think it would have been able to exhibit that type of emotion. I could be wrong, but I just don't think so.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes a lot of the non-human primates do exhibit. I think we're closer to non-human primates than most people realize. I think of Coco the gorilla, and I've told this story before. Coco the gorilla was, and do you know Coco the gorilla, the one that can sign language?
Yeah.
What was fascinating to me is I watched this whole thing on, and I from time to time I'm a big nerd when it comes to stuff like this, which is strange because I don't like the primate exhibit. It's the one exhibit I'll avoid in the zoo for whatever reason. I just, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, what was interesting about Coco the gorilla, she was trying to break out of the place where she was at, and she was trying to go through the window, and she was halfway through the window. They catch her and yell at her, and she comes back in, and they ask her what she was doing, and she said that she was going out for a smoke. She had signed that she was going out for a smoke because she saw the humans going out for a smoke. It just fascinated me that, I don't think we're that far off from non-human primates, some more than others, but I get what you're saying, that the emotions you see. I've talked to witnesses that have seen these things. I had one guy on one time, he said it had like crazy bag lady moments. Like you'd almost see someone with mental issues in a downtown city walking around, gibbering, throwing its hands in the air, just acting like a crazy person. And he said that's what it reminded him of. It wasn't really animal-like. It reminded him of more of someone, a human that had mental issues.
I can see that. Now, something I found interesting, scientists are always looking for the missing link, between humans and everything. And something I've just tossed around in my head is, what if humans are the missing link? We're the what's in between Sasquatch and something else. I don't buy into the whole, it's just something that I thought that popped into my head a while ago is, what if humans are the missing link?
I get what you're saying.
If science is looking at it all wrong, trying to find the missing link, what if we're the missing link? And I just thought that was funny to me.
Yeah, well, I understand. With these things, it's strange, and that's why I like to ask people who've had up-close personal encounters with these things, what do you think they are? In my mind, I think non-human primate, but I realize I'm not too arrogant to realize I could be 100% wrong on my thoughts on this, but they have a lot of animalistic type behavior too as well. But in the same breath, they have very, when you, like you, in your situation, it runs off, it's frustrated, it's angry, and it shows those emotions, which, and I'm not trying to argue with you on what you're saying. I go back to, I think of this chimpanzee I watched, and the chimpanzee in this, it was doing something, I can't remember, it was doing something with a puzzle or something like that, and they were kind of screwing with the chimpanzee on giving it treats and whatnot, and it exhibited revenge on the way it acted. It exhibited, which is a very human-like, very human-like trait, the trait of revenge. And it's interesting because when you look at a lot of these primates, everyone thinks dumb ape or dumb monkey. I don't think a dumb ape or a dumb monkey exists. I think they're a lot smarter than most people realize.
I agree with you there. I think that, and I think most animals, people underestimate animals for the most part. I think most animals are a lot smarter than humans give them credit for. And I know that, some apes, chimpanzees, have the ability to problem solve, but it's all I have to go by is what I saw, and had I more experiences, I might change my mind. But there's people out there that have had a tremendous more amount of experiences than I have. The first one was the only one that I can really say that can speak to. And had I more experiences and noticed more behaviors, I might change my opinion. But just from what I saw, that's what I think.
Yeah, and like I said, there's no wrong answer. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I think that these things are closer to us than most people realize. In my mind, I still think wild animal. But again, at the end of the day, I could be completely wrong.
Yeah, I don't think that they're human, but I totally agree that they are a wild animal. I don't think that I love your guys' term, the flute players, but also that's dangerous too, because those people think that these are teddy bears, and they are not. These things, the strength that they possess, can pop your head like a zit. In a fraction of a second, they can kill you. And I think it's a mistake for the people that think that these things are lovable, cuddly creatures. And I don't think that at all. They are a wild animal. They just, to me, exhibit more human tendencies than other animals.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. It's the flute player thing I came up with. I kind of regret even saying that on the air now, but it's because I used to get so frustrated with people in the Bigfoot world, and I've kind of backed out of the whole Bigfoot world just because there's too many. Anyway, I just backed out of it, but it used to frustrate me because people would say feed them, or you can go out and play the flute for them and give them apples, and it's not reality. I just don't believe that. It's not reality with these things. Now, are they, are these things like a grizzly bear? No, I think they think a little bit more like a grizzly bear. I think in your situation, if that would have been a grizzly bear, that grizzly bear would have mowed you down, and probably wouldn't have even thought twice about mowing you down. But with these things, there's obvious thought. There's frustration. Does it really want to do battle with you? It's not really what it wanted. It wanted the elk. It really didn't want you. And now you have a rifle. And so there's a potential chance of it getting hurt. Like you said, the very human-like emotions where it turns around, walks off, just kind of screams and roars in frustration, tosses its rock aside. In reality, could it have mowed you down? Absolutely. And there wouldn't have been a damn thing you could have done about it.
There wouldn't have been.
But I think that it just didn't, in that situation, it wasn't worth the fight. And that shows thought. That shows thought process.
And that's what I was thinking. When it was standing there staring at me, it was thinking. It was contemplating its next move. That's what I think is, while it's staring at me, what seemed like hours, probably maybe 15 seconds that it stared me down, and it was thinking, what do I do? And that's why, it just stood there and stared at me. And that's when it finally turned away in frustration, got rid of its rock and walked off. I think in that situation, I was very lucky. Listening to your guys' show and the research that I have done, if it would have been a rogue male, I think I would have been in trouble. I think this probably had to be part of a group and not a rogue male. Or if it would have been, some of the other type of creatures, what's the Native American word, the Janoskwa, if it would have been one of the mean ones, I think I could have been in trouble. But I think this was probably a family unit, maybe the alpha, maybe if this thing wasn't the alpha male, I'd hate to see the alpha. Knowing what, research I've done and what, the researchers who I I respect and looked up to have said, if this would have been a rogue male, I think I would have been in trouble.
Yeah, it's hard to say. One thing you said there that I caught on to, and I don't know if you get a chance to read the blog from the 29th when I posted it, the creature seemed to want to leave as much as I did. That's one thing that when I spoke to the witness on the phone, that's one thing he said. He goes, it was calculating. It wasn't like looking at a bear. It wasn't like looking at a deer. It was calculating its next move. It ended up backing off in his situation, and he was just as terrified. He was backing off. But it's interesting when you see the eyes of these creatures, there's calculation going on. It's not just a blank stare.
It wasn't like looking at a wolf standing there staring you down, because the wolf is thinking, yeah, maybe that was a bad analogy, but you know what? I think you understand what I'm thinking is, while it's standing there staring at me, it's not exactly, it wasn't a blank stare. There was thought going on in its head. It was like, I think it was, what do I do next? Here we are. And I agree with the fact that it wanted out of that situation as much as I did, because it had the rock. I mean, if it would have chucked that rock, I don't think that it would have missed. And it saw my rifle. Like you said, I don't think I was worth the risk, because I did have a rifle. I think they know what they are. And if it tried to do something to me, there's the possibility that it could have got hurt. So it chose to walk away. And I am so glad that it did.
Yeah, no, I'm glad it did too. And I think a lot of situations are like that. I think they're opportunistic, but they're not stupid. You know, they will calculate and try and figure out if they, you know, what's it going to, you know, who knows with these things. I kind of get the same impression you do, though. Yeah. They calculate their next move, and is it worth the risk or not? And in your situation, it just wasn't. There was a chance it could have probably walked away just as hurt. It would have gotten you. Don't get me wrong. I think it would have had you. But you might have gotten off a shot or two before it got to you. It's a fascinating encounter, Jimmy. It really is. And I'm really glad that it walked off. And
you know, I was hearing everybody's encounters, and mine, I have never heard anybody's like it. I was kind of afraid to tell it, because it's like I have never heard one like it. And I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of encounters, and you know, it still shakes me up. I'm trying to tell it tonight. It still has me, you know, like you said, it brings everything back to the front. But it does. One thing I want to thank you for is being able to talk about it has helped. I didn't realize, you know, holding it in for so long, how much it has affected me. It did on one part, you know, an obsession with wanting to know more about them and know what they are. But I don't know, it feels like there's a weight lifted off of my chest, being able to tell somebody about it that without judgment. I really appreciate that.
No, I appreciate it, Jimmy. And I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing it. I think it helps others. I think more people run into these things. It's like I was telling someone the other day, what you hear on the show is probably 0.25% of the encounters. I know people hear the show, they think all these people are having encounters. I think it's a fraction of the people that have actually run into these things. You know, we gather more information as more people come forward on their behavior. You know, it's like I was just telling you the other day, I mean, just based on types. You'd be surprised how you could nail down the type of creatures people run into based on location. I truly believe there's different types of these things. And I know Bob Garrett used to tell me the ones that look more human are generally smarter and are just more intelligent creatures and are less apt to attack you. He said the ones that look more chimp-like, the ones that have more of that appearance, have zero qualms about attacking you. And that's what he runs into down there in Texas. And so you learn so much from witnesses coming forward. I just can't thank you enough for coming on the show.
Well, I appreciate you letting me. I believe it has helped. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Jimmy, for coming on. And thank you guys for listening. That's it for tonight. I hope everyone has a safe and happy 4th of July. Until next time, everyone, have a great night.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
To the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. I want to send my heart out to the heart and prayers out to the people of Dallas. You know, the police officers out there that were shot. It's terrible, terrible, terrible shooting. And I know the shooting of the man, I think he was in Louisiana or maybe it was Minnesota. That was nothing more than an execution by the police in my mind. And my heart goes out to that family too. It's a terrible world we live in. Well, you're not here for that. Let's jump into it tonight. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email, wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. So if you've had an encounter or anything going on out there, shoot me an email. Let me know about it. I'd love to speak with you. I'd love to have you on the show. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Jason to the show. Jason, how you doing tonight?
Oh, pretty good, man.
Good. And I know you had sent me your encounter. I was pretty interested by it. For the audience, if you would, kind of walk them right into the encounter. Tell us what you're out doing. And then if you would, just walk us right into what you saw, what you experienced.
Okay. I'll kind of have to paint the picture and, kind of give you a little insight into the terrain. And a couple things about myself to kind of, I guess, explain my reaction to this. So I grew up in Southwest Louisiana. And I'm sure you have a good idea about the difficulty of the terrain out there because you've been down to Big Thicket out in East Texas. And Southwest Louisiana is similar to that, only they don't have nearly as many hills. As small as the hills are in Big Thicket, Louisiana is just flat. The ground, is pretty even, but it's not nearly as solid. Instead of that dry, almost sandy soil you have in a lot of Big Thicket, a lot of Southwest Louisiana has black rotten leaves and gray mud. And I've spent a lot of time, exploring the swamps and everything out there. And, it's hiking through there is extremely difficult. It's the brush is about as dense as Big Thicket, only instead of like the tall grass, you have razor sharp palmettos. And instead of raccoons, we have giant snapping turtles and 14-foot alligators and 5-inch long leeches. So it's definitely a different world, and getting through there, hiking around in those areas is extremely difficult, and it's probably one of the reasons there aren't any real hiking trails down there, because the ground just isn't very solid for long stretches. So, as a kid, and growing up, I wanted to go hiking and backpacking, but there was really nowhere to do that, not unless you went all the way up to, like, Alexandria to the Kisatchie Forest. So in my area, what you had to do was go hike the railroad tracks. And so I grew up doing that, because it was the only place where you could have, secure footing for miles on end. So did a lot of backpacking on the railroad tracks all over Southwest Louisiana, parts of East Texas, even out through the Big Thicket area. And I did most of these solo because most of my friends, they didn't like backpacking. They liked car camping. So I would go for multi-day solo trips, whenever I was 17, 18, all the way up into my 30s. And that's pretty much how I spent my weekends. Get off a long week of work, grab the backpack, head out to the middle of nowhere, or get someone to drop me off a couple towns over, and then hike back home and just camp wherever I could, or just cut cross country, and blaze my own trail if the terrain, permitted. And, so I did a lot of that. Now, most people probably wouldn't find too much interest in the swamps. I mean, you think of the swamps, you think of like horror movies, no one goes into the swamps. But the swamps kind of have their own beauty, if you actually go in there and kind of explore them, especially at night, which you kind of have to do your hiking at night in Louisiana, because even in December, it's incredibly hot. I mean, for Christmas, I wear a T-shirt and shorts, but at night in the swamps, it's usually pretty bright because the trees are kind of scattered, the big cypress trees, you get out there on a full moon, and you usually have pretty good lighting. You don't need a flashlight. And the swamps just have their own beauty, especially in the early morning hours. Everything just kind of goes still and quiet, as opposed to the deafening sound of all the crickets and frogs and everything you hear, in the late evening. In the early morning, it gets really quiet, as if the whole swamp is just holding its breath right before dawn. And so hopefully I kind of painted a good enough picture, and kind of explain why I was always out there.
And it's important for people to understand that, too. I mean, this isn't your first rodeo out in the woods, you know what I mean? You've been out there, you've traveled, you're a woodsman, you know what's out there, what's not out there. And that's what makes the story so interesting, in my mind.
Right, right.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, that's good. And, I mean, like you're saying, I first started hiking the tracks with my older brother when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And if you drop me off on any railroad track in the southwest quarter of Louisiana, or most of them in southeast Texas, it won't take me long to figure out exactly where I'm at, because I know those tracks about as well as most people know the roads in their own hometown. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many, if I added it all up, months I have spent just out there alone in the backcountry, middle of nowhere, complete isolation. And I wanted to identify, different animal noises, coyotes, some of the different noises alligators make, whooping cranes, all these different things, bobcats, even the cougars. A lot of people say there are no cougars in Louisiana. And then just recently, a state trooper actually captured footage of one on his dash cam about 5 miles from where I grew up. He was driving down one of these highways, and a cougar ran out in front of his car. And it made the news, and everyone was talking about how this was like the first confirmed cougar sighting in like 75 years or something. And I just kind of had to laugh, because I could give you the names of 10 people that I'm related to that have seen cougars. I mean, I've seen their footprints. They're out there. There aren't many, and they're so far out there that most people don't see them.
What did you think about Bigfoot prior to this experience? You'd heard the wolves, you'd heard the cougars, you'd heard all the animals. What was your take on Sasquatch?
Honestly, I thought that, in my opinion, before this one particular night, was that people were probably seeing like a bear walk upright, and then their mind just ran wild, and they built a story off of that. And I've seen stuff sort of like that, where a person gets scared about something, and then their mind, as each time they retell the story, and sometimes over the course of just an hour or two, this little minuscule event gets blown out of proportion, and they honestly believe every word they said. And I'm just dumbfounded, because I was right there and I saw what happened, and it wasn't anything like they described. But when a person gets scared, sometimes other things would pop up. And I was like, they're probably seeing bears. Someone probably saw a bear, and then it got, they didn't know what it was. They panicked, and then they started talking about Bigfoot. And that was pretty much my opinion, growing up.
So you weren't a real big believer in Sasquatch prior to this?
No. I mean, when I was a kid, I saw the film with Leonard Nimoy. I don't remember what it was called. I saw it on TV one night, and I believed in Bigfoot then. But by the time I was a teenager, I would say, if you had asked me then, when I was about 16 or 17, to rank my belief in Bigfoot, I would have put it somewhere along the lines of leprechauns and unicorns. It was just, okay, yeah, some people believe in it, but, come on, there's no such thing.
And I can appreciate that, the leprechauns and unicorns. I think a lot of people feel that way, but it's a whole different ballgame when you run into them. If you would kind of walk us into the encounter, tell us what you were doing, and you'd mentioned the tracks. Were you on the tracks at the time?
Yeah, I was on the railroad tracks, heading south from DeQuincy. I'd had someone drop me off in the town of DeQuincy, which is off of Highway 27. And so I'd started walking south from DeQuincy, and I'd gone, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15 miles the previous day. And this was sometime at night. It was in the fall. I remember that. I wouldn't have been out there in the summer, that's for sure. It's just too hot. And so it was probably late fall or early winter. And so I'm heading south on the tracks. And this was near, there's a road out there called High Hope Road. And I used to live down there. Anyway, so I was heading down the tracks. I passed High Hope Road. I was further south by about a mile and a half or 2 miles, and the tracks make a big bend to the right. And at that point, they run perfectly north and south until they hit a road called Houston River Road, which is right next to a river. There's a big swamp nearby. And so I'm walking down these tracks, heading directly south. I'm not exactly sure what time of night it was. It was either a full moon or almost a full moon. And the moon was a little bit into the western half of the sky. It wasn't directly overhead. And because it was a little in the west, all the trees on my right side, on the west side of the tracks, were casting, long shadows. Most of them completely covered the tracks. And so you'd have long expanses of the rail that were just in complete shadow. And so I'm walking down the tracks, and I'm not making much noise because I'm actually balanced on one of the rails. I'm balanced on the right-hand rail, and I'm cruising down the tracks. And, like I said, it's pretty much complete darkness except for this little patch of moonlight a little ways ahead where there's like a gap in the trees to the right. And so there's some moonlight spilling onto the tracks. And I'm approaching this little patch of light. And like I said, not really making any noise, which was, looking back on it, I think that was the main problem. Because if you're on the tracks, you're actually walking on the rails and you're not making any noise at all, nothing that's coming along is going to be able to really hear you, especially if it comes out of the dense undergrowth that's beside the tracks. Now, these tracks are elevated about 4 to 5 feet because the whole area is prone to flooding because it's so near the river and a large swamp. So I'm walking on these tracks. I'm heading south. And when I'm just a couple feet away from the edge of the shadows, about to step into the moonlight, this large bipedal hairy animal comes up out of the bushes beside me. And the bushes are at that point so close to the rails that whenever it stepped out, it was right at the embankment for the tracks. And so 1 or 2 steps later, it's on the tracks right in front of me. Now, when I say right in front of me, if it had swung out its left arm, it would have hit me. I mean, we almost collided. If it had stepped out a half second later, we would have run into one another and probably wouldn't be on the phone right now. It was, terrifying enough being that close. I can't imagine if we had been any closer. So this thing steps out. I can't get too good of a look at it because, like I said, it's nighttime. I can mainly just see an outline. It's a large, dark, hairy creature. It's definitely on 2 legs. It steps up onto the tracks right in front of me, and its sudden appearance, of course, startles me. I slip off the tracks. My feet hit the gravel. I start scrambling backward, and that instant, I was basically coming out of the shadows. So it saw me right around the same time that I saw it. And so it's suddenly in front of me. I'm immediately to its left. I start to scramble back. It spins, hunches down, and lets out this tremendous roar. It was like half roar, half bark. and it was powerful, Wes. I mean, like, you could actually feel it in your chest. So I'm scrambling back, and the first thing I do is I kind of shrink down, I throw up my left hand, and I just start saying, easy, easy, easy. Almost the reaction you would do if you bumped into a big drunk guy in a bar and he turned around ready to fight. And it was just this sudden reaction, you know, and there was no thought that went into it. It was just reflex. And it's kind of a reflex that I developed when, you know, going out in the marshes and things, because sometimes you run into alligators. You're stamping down marsh grass, and all of a sudden you almost step on a 10-foot alligator, and it spins towards you. And the first thing you have to do is start backing away. And so I'm doing that, and I'm backing away. I throw out my left hand. I'm just like, easy, 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 because my mind couldn't make sense of it. It was just this large thing, and I guess I was reacting as if it was just a really big guy. But I've never met a person that big. I've got some pretty big friends, and they're not nearly that large, and they're not, you know, covered in hair. Well, some of them are kind of hairy, but not like this. So yeah. I'm backing up. I'm scrambling away, and my left hand is out. I guess just kind of warded off, and my right hand instinctively goes to my back where I keep like it's like a bushcraft knife or like a camp knife. Got about a 6-inch blade. And so I grab onto that and I pull it about halfway out of the sheath. And, you know, the instant it had seen me, it spun toward me. It let out this roar. It kind of hunches down a little more. You know, it's already kind of hunched, I guess, from walking up the embankment because it's pretty steep. And then it hunches over more. It lets out this roar. Its shoulders come up. Its arms are out. And it's letting out these rapid, deep, panting breaths. And I just knew then it was going to charge me. You know, it did not look or sound friendly. It sounded startled and angry. And so I'm stepping back. I keep saying, easy, easy, easy. That's the only thing I can even think to say. And then my mind freezes because I'm staring at this thing that 2 seconds earlier, in my mind, did not exist. And my brain just couldn't accept the information that it was getting from my eyes. It was right there. I could see it plain as day. I could hear it. I could smell it, but I couldn't accept it. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the artwork of M.C. Escher. He did a lot of like pencil drawings that have like optical illusions. And he has this real famous one. If you do a Google image search for Escher stairs, you'll find it. It's the staircase that goes up on 4 sides. It goes up and turns right, goes up another flight and turns right, goes up again and turns right, goes up a 4th time and ends up right back at the bottom where it started. And so it's this whole optical illusion. All 4 sides go up, but it makes a perfect square. And no matter how much you go up, you still end up at the bottom, you know? And it's this whole thing you can draw, but you can't actually build. It's an optical illusion. And seeing this thing was like looking at that picture and trying to make sense of it. You know, you go up and up and up and up and end up at the bottom, you know? And so I'm looking at this thing, this large, hairy Sasquatch that's standing right in front of me, just, you know, at this point, maybe 6 or 7 feet away. And that's only because I backed up. And I can't accept it. It's like, this is an ape man. It walked out of the darkness. It's standing right before me. It doesn't exist. And I was just caught on this loop. I had the information, but I couldn't accept it. And then its breathing slowed. It moved a step or two to its right, which made it to my left. And while still facing me, it kind of sidestepped down the east embankment of the tracks. And then it turned toward the bushes, but it still had its head facing me. And it just walked right into the bushes. The whole encounter, from the time it stepped out of the shadows in front of me to the time that it stepped off into the bushes on the other side, I would say it was maybe 10 seconds. Maybe, could have been even shorter. It was not very long at all. Then after that, I just kind of stood there for a minute, just looking at the bushes where it vanished, and, kind of slowed my breathing. And then the adrenaline started to fade and my hands started to shake. So I pushed my knife back in the sheath and I kind of knelt down right where I was standing. I put my hands on the rail of the track and just shook for a few minutes, and I'm just holding onto the rail and my hands are shaking. Yeah, I couldn't have stood at that point, so I'm glad a train wasn't coming. And then I kind of slumped to my left side. I slowly turned, so I was basically sitting in the middle of the railroad tracks. My backpack leaned up against the east rails, so I'm now facing away from where this thing vanished into the bushes. I draped my legs over the rails on the opposite side, and I just stared at the silhouettes of the trees for a couple of minutes while I just kind of, slowed my pulse, swallowed my heart. And then after a couple of minutes, everything kind of clicked into place. And I remember the words because they kind of stuck with me for days. I just said, I just saw that. And those 4 words, I just saw that. They just stuck with me because it was at that moment that my brain was finally able to accept what, all this information that my eyes had fed me over this 10-second encounter, and, convinced me, okay, this thing, it exists. There's at least one of them. I just saw it. So then after that, once I calmed down, I was able to stand up. I made sure I still had my knife, made sure my pack was secure. I took a drink of water. I walked probably about another 2 miles or so and then made camp for the night. And, that's basically what happened, that completely changed my view concerning these things.
What did you think it was when you first ran into it?
Honestly, I was operating more off of adrenaline and reflex. There really wasn't much thought. It's just suddenly there was something gigantic in front of me, and all I could think to do, or not really think, but my reaction, I guess, to suddenly startling a large, dangerous creature was to try to appear less threatening and create some distance. And that was basically it. There wasn't really much thought as to, what this was until a couple seconds had passed. And that's when I realized that, I'm staring at this creature that, while hunched over, is a good 6.5, 7 feet tall, and had to be at least, 3.5 feet wide at the shoulders, and completely covered in hair. And that's when my brain started to, misfire. Because then I was trying to understand, what I was looking at. It's like I knew I was looking at the things that people call a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, but I couldn't really think about it, if that makes sense. I guess it'd be like if you were stuck on the side of the road, you're parked on the shoulder, you got your cell phone up to your ear, you're talking to your Allstate agent, and you're saying, yes, ma'am, I just hit a dragon with my Buick. Your brain can't really put that together in a real scenario. And so I don't really think I was thinking about what this thing was, not at first. At first, it was just this large, hairy creature that was suddenly 2 or 3 feet in front of me. And so, there wasn't much thought. It was more reaction for the first few seconds.
And I agree with that. There's this weird thing that kicks in to where it's I guess, fight or flight type mode. And you're right. You go into these, I'm sure looking back at your encounter, it's like, wow, I handled that really well. But you'd be amazed what you can do when your heart rate's elevated, your fear is elevated, everything's elevated, and you go into protection mode. And you can kind of read situations a lot faster than you can when you're not elevated like that.
Right. And I've that area, that there's a real bad problem with stray dogs. A lot of people, they take their dogs way outside of town, out into those areas, and they dump them off if they don't want them. And if there's just one or two of them, that's fine. But when there are a lot of them, they pack together and they tend to become aggressive. And so out there hiking the tracks, I've encountered sometimes 4 or 5 dogs, who just came out of nowhere and basically cornered me. And so that kind of became a reflex that I developed pretty quick. You may hike, every weekend for 3 months without incident, and then one day 4 or 5 dogs come up and start barking and snarling at you, and you're miles from the nearest road. What do you do? And it quickly became the reaction to put your left arm out, because if they're going to bite something, let them bite something give them something to bite that isn't vital. So I'd put my left arm out, and with my right arm, I would grab my knife. And if the dog did attack, I could defend myself while it's working on my left arm, instead of my neck. So, that was kind of like it became a reflex after a few years, and that's probably why I reacted like that, because I'd been in situations similar to that with some of these stray dogs.
Was there anything about the way the creature was proportioned that threw you off a little bit?
When I was first taking in, the actual sight of it, I pretty quickly, ruled out the possibility that this was a person. I mean, because even if you have like a person in a suit, their shoulders won't stick out that far. It'll be pretty obvious. And this thing, its upper body at least was proportioned kind of like that of a gorilla. I mean, it's just very thick, very broad-shouldered, and the arms were just they were massive. There's no other way to describe them. And then just the sheer size of it. It was, like I said, hunched over. I'd say about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. And that's being hunched over from walking up the embankment and then turning, and kind of assuming a defensive posture. And it's just, people just don't get that big. When they are, when people are tall, they're not also, 500 pounds. They're definitely not built like that. And it was just, I couldn't get too good a look at the legs. I wasn't really focused on the lower body. I mean, I'd seen for a split second that I was walking upright, and then after that, I was mainly focused on the silhouette, of the upper body of this creature, so I could try to determine if it was going to charge me or not. But yeah, the upper body looked proportioned sort of like a gorilla. The head wasn't gorilla-shaped, though. I don't know, gorillas kind of have they seem to have kind of like a tall head. And it I don't know, it didn't quite look like that. Then again, it was kind of hunched over when it was facing me, so it was hard to tell. I mean, it was backlit from the moonlight, so I could really only see like the outline of it. As far as actual head shape or what the face looked like, it was all shadows. I couldn't really say, but proportion-wise, it was just, it was, very gorilla, very ape-like, and it was larger than a person, taller and wider. And like I said, shoulders were just disproportionately broad, not what you see on a person, definitely not what you would see on an animal like a bear. Bears have very slumped shoulders, they have a very distinct profile, I live in the Carolinas now. I know what, black bears and things look like. This did not have that profile at all.
As you were backing up and saying easy, 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 what was the creature doing? Could you tell the way it was breathing or its posture? Had any of that changed as you backed up and had your hand out?
Yeah. So, at first it had let out this tremendous, I guess, like startled and angry roar. And then as I was backing up, it was letting out these deep, heavy breaths, almost like a pant. And, you know, it was panting pretty quickly at first. And then after a couple of seconds, its panting began to slow. And I think that was around the time, I guess, like when I realized that it was sort of like diffusing the situation, that I kind of, you know, started to realize what I was looking at. But yeah, its breathing began to slow a couple seconds after I moved back. I guess it realized that it was a thing that startled it and wasn't, you know, I wasn't something that was trying to attack it. After a few seconds, yeah, it seemed like it started to calm down, and breathing slowed. It became, you know, more shallow, you know, just sounded less threatening, less like it was getting ready to charge.
Yeah, no, and that's terrifying, especially when you don't really know what you're looking at. It roars at you. It's bigger than you are, and it's heavy breathing as you're backing up, saying easy, easy, easy. You know, I don't blame you for reaching for your knife. I probably would have done the same thing. I would probably would have had a gun on me at the time, but and I was kind of curious on why you thought it didn't attack you. Do you think it was mainly just because you weren't really a threat at that point?
Yeah, I'm like, so I've heard on some interviews, you know, both on your show and, you know, from other podcasts and things, where some people are talking about how these things are like these, like, murderous, rampaging beasts. And I've heard other people say that they're these gentle giants. And it's like, I think that they can both be right and wrong. You know, my impression was that, I mean, this thing is definitely predatory. I've had enough experience with all different types of animals, anything from wild dogs to bobcats to 14-foot alligators, to know that if you startle a predatory animal, they turn toward the potential danger, not away. You startle a deer, you see its backside while it runs. You startle a bear, it spins toward you, not away. Its reaction was that of an animal that is at least partially predatory, which basically is any omnivore. It spun toward me, not away. So obviously this is an animal capable of violence. You know, it went toward the danger. It didn't flee from it. Now, if this had been like a female with a bunch of young around, well, any animal will put itself between the danger and its young. But this is a solitary creature, you know. So it obviously is capable of violence. But at the same time, it never moved forward. Once it realized I wasn't a threat, you know, and the situation kind of leveled out, it moved off and went on its way. So I think it was initially just startled by me, enraged, put in its own fight or flight situation, you know, put into an aggressive state, and then within a matter of seconds realized that the thing that startled it wasn't a threat. And so it basically chose to just move on. So I don't, after that, I kind of just treated it, you know, basically like any other animal that I've encountered. As long as I give it space and don't pose a threat to it, it probably won't mess with me.
The other thing you have to think about, though, is, you know, predators are unpredictable, too, in the same breath. A predator is very unpredictable. Prey is pretty much predictable. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is, you know, it depends on really what you run into in that situation. I mean, honestly, I think you're lucky to be alive. I'm shocked it didn't come at you. You know, whether you're putting your hand out saying easy, 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 you know, a grizzly bear's not going to care two qualms about you putting your hand out saying easy, easy. I mean, it may stop and kind of look at that. And, you know, a cougar is going to do the same thing. You know, if a cougar wants you and all of a sudden now you're a potential threat, it's probably just going to charge you. It's not going to. So I guess in the same breath, it goes back showing the intelligence of these things too.
Right. And, you know, like I said, I've had experience with a wide variety of animals. I prefer dealing with stupid animals. The dumber the animal, even I would rather deal with a 14-foot alligator than a dog, like an unknown dog. I'd rather come up on a 14-foot alligator than a random dog, because a dog is more intelligent. They're less predictable. I know how an alligator will react, based on the situation, based on what I do. If I want an alligator to react a certain way, I know, okay, if I go and do this, the alligator will do this. And if I do that 10 times in a row to 10 different alligators, I'll get the same reaction all 10 times. Do that with a dog. Do that with your own dog. Sometimes you go to interact with a dog, you grab one of its toys, you squeak it or something, to try to get the dog to play, and he just looks at you like you're an idiot. And then you do it again 5 minutes later, and he goes crazy, and he grabs the toy, and he starts running around the house having a blast, Alligators don't do that. They're more simple-minded. You do one thing, the alligator responds accordingly, because there's not really a thought process. And when you have something like a large primate, you don't know from 1 minute to the next how it's going to react, even if you think the situation is the same both times, because, maybe the thing is just eaten, Right. It's like a math equation, there are so many different variables going in, you don't know how it's going to turn out. With a simpler animal, like reptiles, the equation is very short. There are only a couple of variables, and now you know the answer. So it's
yeah, and that's a really, really good analogy. It's a really good analogy. I was thinking about, and I've talked about on those past shows about bouncing. I'd walk into a bar. I could almost tell you who's going to fight and who's not going to fight.
Right.
But what was strange is you never really knew how someone was. You never really truly knew how someone was going to react. You'd almost have to encounter them, speak to them for about 10 seconds, and then come to a conclusion on how they're probably going to react. And I got pretty good at that. In the same breath, you just never know. And you're right. With these things, you never know what you're going to run into. You might have run into one that was hungry, in a bad mood, wasn't in the mood for being surprised, and decided it was going to rip your arms off and beat you with them.
Right.
But the one you ran into probably, honestly, didn't realize you were there. You guys and you hear that sometimes with hunters. I've talked to hunters in the past where they'll come in contact with Sasquatch, and it's almost like they both just want to leave. They don't want to be there. You can tell the hunter he's scared, he wants to go. Sasquatch is scared and wants to go. But they'll sit and look at each other for 15, 20, 30 seconds, and then they depart from one another.
Right.
You get done with it, walks off, it goes back to wherever it came from. You go to set up camp. Are you worried the rest of the night? You said it was only about 2 miles away. Are you thinking all night, Jesus, I hope that thing doesn't come back?
Yeah, well, I went, a couple miles away. I set up camp, and it took a while to go to sleep. Even walking a little while, which typically calms me down, my adrenaline was, my heart was still going, I was still pretty alert. And so I had to sit there for a couple hours before I was ready to go to sleep. But I really wasn't too concerned about it coming back, because the way I thought was it was in the mood and a perfect position to just steamroll me. And it didn't. More than likely, I'm not going to see it again tonight. And, the more I thought about it, I was like, this is the type of reaction I would expect from just about any other animal that wasn't in the mood to hunt me down. We startle each other. There's a moment of tension, and then we move apart and go our separate ways. And so I figured that was probably the end of it. And so I wasn't too concerned about seeing it again. I'm sure I had a good idea of where I was, and it was obviously going in a different direction. And so, I didn't really have too many concerns about seeing it again that night. And after a few hours, I'd say probably about, I don't know, maybe about 3 hours after I encountered it was when I finally went to sleep. My thoughts were mainly on just trying to figure this thing out, because I was always exploring as a kid. I loved finding things new. And then suddenly I found something really new, something that shouldn't exist. I mean, this is a discovery of a lifetime, and so I was mainly concerned with that, just trying to figure out, what this thing was, and what it was doing there when it clearly shouldn't be there at all. So that was my main focus of thought for the rest of that night.
Did you have any more encounters after this?
There was one that I had. It was probably about 3 or 4 years later, and just a few miles away. And then there were some others that I had heard about from the forest to the northwest of there, a place called Boise Cascade. It's the Boise Cascade Logging owns this, huge tracts of land. Basically, it's a timber farm. A lot of pine woods that they harvest for the lumber mills and paper mills around there. We actually started referring to it after that as the Boise Bigfoot, because there had been some sightings in that area by some other people.
Tell us about your second encounter.
So it's probably about 3 years later, somewhere around there. So probably around 2004, 2005, somewhere in that area. I was doing a solo canoe trip on some of the different backwaters in that area, and I launched through a place called Holbrook Park, which was only a few miles from where I'd had this first encounter. It's not too remote now. There are a lot of people that live in that area, up on stilt houses. But at the time, very few people in that area at all. It was just, dense woods and swamps. And the only people who went out there were squirrel hunters. So I was out there doing a little canoeing trip, and I was going down this little, you could barely call it a river. So I'm paddling down this river, and it's maybe 50 feet wide, and it's just a little winding, river, cuts through the hardwoods, and there's really no current at all. I mean, if you go by fishing one day and you see a dead limb floating in the water, and you come back a week later, you'll probably still see it in, the same area. The water barely moves. So I'm paddling through there, it's real quiet, everything's real still. And I come around this one little bend, and I just got this feeling that something was watching me. You get that feeling, it's almost like an itch on your shoulder. And, so I kind of slowed my paddling, I switched sides, and as I went to paddle, and I let my body turn with the stroke, I kind of let my head swivel, and without actually looking in the direction that I thought, this animal or person was, I kind of used just like my peripheral vision to try to scan around for it. And I saw this shape, and it kind of startled me because it was what I thought was a person, probably about 15 or 20 feet back from the bank, standing by this tree. And so it kind of startled me, and I looked up, actually directly at it. And it was basically the same thing I had seen, about 3 or 4 years earlier. Probably about 7 feet tall, completely covered in hair. The body, the torso, like I said, very gorilla-like, but it had legs more like a person. Proportionately, maybe not as long as a person's legs would have been if they were that same height. It may have had more torso, but considering, that it was covered in hair, it's kind of hard to tell exactly where the legs end and the hips begin. So not exactly sure about the leg proportions. It was a very, I say a very dark brown, almost black. It had a very, I think kind of like an ape-like face, mostly kind of flattened, but like around the mouth, not really like a snout, like on, just the mouth kind of protruded slightly. I guess almost like you see some of the different like transitional fossils, kind of somewhere between, the early hominids and people, where the jaw and like just beneath the nose, everything kind of protrudes a little. There's very little hair on its face. It's like hair on top of his head, hair, on the sides. On the actual face itself, with the exception of like the brow ridge, it was pretty much hairless. It was just dark skin. And it was basically just standing there, like its right shoulder and arm kind of hidden behind this tree, just watching me as I drifted by.
And so did it watch you the whole time as you went by?
Yeah, it was basically just standing there by this large oak. Like I said, about 20 or so feet back from the bank. It was starting to get dark. It was probably only about 30 or 45 minutes from the sun setting. And I just come around a bend. If it hadn't been for, assuming it was in the same spot, if it hadn't been for that tree, I would have seen it before I went into that bend, because I basically made like a big loop around it. I kind of came up on one side of it, went around the bend, and as I was, exiting the curve, that's when I saw the thing on my left-hand side. And it basically just stood there, kind of slightly hunched, and watched me pass. And I started trying to hurry up and turn the canoe so I wouldn't pass out of sight from it. So, I paddled back a little bit. I spun the canoe, and when I looked down to paddle, I looked back up, and the thing was already moving through the trees, kind of angled away from the river. And in just a couple more seconds, it was lost in the underbrush and the trees and all that.
Yeah, that's amazing, especially being able to see him twice. Do you think it could have been the same creature? Right now, it's kind of a hard question to answer because the first one, you didn't get a great look at it.
Right. I mean, it was roughly the same size, but, the first one I saw, it was just a silhouette. And I mean, in the moonlight, everything basically becomes black and white, a black shape, white outline. And that's basically all I can see. The second time I got a much better look at it, but if I had seen them one day apart, I couldn't have told you if they were the same one. I can tell you they were roughly the same size, but beyond that, anything I say would just be, conjecture.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Did you ever worry about going out there? I mean, did you kind of give up the whole I'm going out,
No,
walking the tracks by myself?
I started carrying a pistol after that. I started bringing a 45 with hollow points, but I really never stopped going out there. I was still making solo backpacking trips through there, Big Thicket and other areas, right up until the point where I moved out of state. Apart from those two instances, like I said, once I think around 2001 and the other time around 2004 or 2005, I never saw or heard anything else.
Yeah, it's just amazing being able to. That the one on the train tracks would have scared the hell out of me, especially being as close as you were.
Oh, I was terrified, especially like after it was over. I think I was even more scared in the first couple minutes after it was over. Like I said, I couldn't even stand after that. Right after it stepped into the bushes, I was on my knees, and then I was just sitting down in the middle of the railroad tracks. I couldn't walk. I was that shaken.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I think that fear that kicks in, that fight or flight, the fear part of it that kicks in where we decide to fight or we're in a position to fight, I think really protects us, especially from predators. Because, if you start screaming and then you take off running, it's just going to run you down because it's just going to get rid of you.
Right.
And that's how most predators think. All of a sudden now you become a potential predator to prey. But if you just stand there and you hold your ground like you did, a lot of predators don't know what to do in that situation because it's like, hey, he's not running off. This is going to be a fight. Is it worth the fight? I was curious, after seeing them twice and experiencing them, did you ever talk to anyone about this, about your encounter?
At first, no. That was one of the things I thought about after that first encounter. When I was sitting under my tarp, about, 100 yards off the tracks. That was one of the things I was thinking about. I was like, no one's going to believe me. And then later, what I decided, probably sometime before I went to bed that night, was that I would kind of do some fishing, just kind of probe the waters, see if anyone, any of my friends or anybody, because we used to have a lot of really big campouts, 10 or 15 vehicles out in the field, huge bonfire, lots of beer. And then after the party kind of calms down, people kind of sit around in small groups and chat about random stuff, and everything kind of takes a more serious tone, and, and at that point, what I decided to do was start, anytime we did that, I would kind of start probing to see if anyone had ever experienced anything weird. And I probably waited about 6 or 8 months before I did anything like that. And what I found, like at first, people were talking about, one of the local cemeteries that they were positive was haunted, different things like that. And then I talked to this one guy, I think his last name, Arsenault, I believe. And he was telling me about a guy that his dad worked with, who worked, he was a logger for the Boise Cascade. And he would go out there, I think his job was like to mark trees or something. So that this guy, along with several other people, apparently, had been out there to an area probably, I'd say maybe about 10 miles away from where I had this first encounter. It's like to the northwest of there. And they were out in the big, pine forest, the timber farm. And they were out there, basically, marking trees, for whenever they go and thin out a large section to remove some of the younger trees to give the rest of them more room to grow. So they were out there doing that. They're marking some of the trees that they're going to pull, and apparently had an encounter with one of these things almost instantly. All 4 of these guys, who I think they were maybe mid to late 40s, Boise Cascade, which I think that was the company that had hired them. I think that's who they worked for. Let all 4 of them retire, and they all retired comfortably, from what this guy told me. And so there was never any kind of like real report. It was something that this guy only heard about because his dad was close friends with one of these guys. And over the next couple of years, I heard several more stories like that, where loggers out in this area, this massive timber farm, they would have an encounter, and I can't say for certain, it almost seemed like they were being paid to not say anything. Like they would go quiet. There would never be anything official, no one talking to the news, no police reports, no 911 calls or anything. And then these guys, they would suddenly get a retirement package, or they would get like a promotion, and they would no longer be out in the field anymore. And the only people who would hear about them were, like a coworker or a close friend or a family member. And it always felt like they weren't supposed to talk about it, because they wouldn't talk about it in front of a bunch of people. They would only talk about it to like closer friends or something. And they're always like, yeah, don't really tell anybody. And so I always wondered, and I can't prove any of this. I can't even verify any of the stories, but it always felt like the timber farm that owned I don't even know how big these timber farms are. It goes through probably a dozen parishes. Louisiana has parishes, not counties. And so, I mean, these are massive tracts of land that they get, planted, grown, thinned out, clear cut and harvested and then replanted. And it's just a big cyclical thing. And you can drive for hours and hours on the highway and you're in these timber farms and hundreds of thousands of acres, if not more. And so I always wondered if this company, if they didn't know about these things and were trying to keep it quiet so that that area couldn't become basically like a wildlife refuge, so kind of protected land, because then they could end up losing half of their timber farm. And it's just, and like I can't. This is speculation, but I mean something like this happened back in the 40s with that. It was I think a woodpecker in, I believe, southern Arkansas. Very similar situation, and there was a huge legal battle, and eventually they had to basically. It looked like they were going to end up losing this timber farm, but they managed to win the court battle or whatever, and they got to clear cut the thing, and no one ever saw this woodpecker again. If something like that happened today with a great ape, I mean, there's no doubt about it. That place would be shut down. They would never be able to log there again.
Well, let me ask you this. You saw two of them. What do you think they are? What do you think these creatures are?
My personal opinion, some kind of higher primate, some great ape. Somewhere between gorillas and early hominids, something like that. I've heard some people talk about like teleportation and telekinesis and ESP and how they talk to them through their minds. Hey, maybe they experienced that. What I experienced, it just acted like a, semi-intelligent animal, about like I would expect a gorilla or a chimp or something to act. It acted just like a large primate. And so that, I really don't have anything else to base my opinion on other than those two encounters, but it just seemed like a large animal, something omnivorous, definitely something that can be predatory based on its initial reaction, but also something kind of intelligent because, especially that second encounter, it wasn't afraid of me. It seemed to just, because it, when I was paddling by, it never like ran. It didn't bolt. But it was watching me intently. It seemed to just be expressing curiosity. It just seems like a semi-intelligent, not like, I don't know if I would say like human intelligence, but, like primate intelligence,
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. It's the whole Stargate, the mind speaking, the cloaking. If it had any superpowers, you'd think being startled and running into you, that would have been a great time to turn on the energy shield or jump into the portal or mind speak to you, let you know it's not any harm, or cloak. But that's the thing, is when people run into them, that's not what they do. The witnesses I've had on the show, what they report is it roared at me, it growled at me, it turned and we looked at each other for a minute or 30 seconds, and then it turned around and decided to walk off. You never really hear the superpowers from people who just run into them. And you would think if Sasquatch had those powers, hey, this would be a great time to use them. It didn't know if you had a gun. It didn't know you're reaching for your knife. That would have been a great time to mind speak to you and let you know, hey, I'm not going to harm you. Put your knife away. But that's not reality. It's not the reality with these things. It's not. I'm sorry, it's not. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of weird things in this world, and I believe in a lot of the paranormal stuff outside of Bigfoot. Like ghosts and whatnot. There's something to that. But what I'm trying to say is, in this particular subject, it's kind of irrelevant at this point because that's not really what they do. I haven't had hundreds of witnesses say, yeah, it cloaked. Yeah, it opened a portal and jumped out of here. If that was the case, I would be I'd be more apt to entertain that subject, but that's not really what happens when people run into them. Sorry to go off on a tangent.
Right. And I wonder if, if some of this comes from people who are inexperienced in the woods, because even though it was walking on gravel, walking up and down the other side of the railroad track embankment, it barely made any noise. When it came out of the bushes, it barely made any noise. Despite being so large, it moved very quietly. And people who aren't familiar with the way wild animals move, they would think that's supernatural. I mean, I've gone backpacking with, friends who had never gone camping before, and when some wild pigs, we have a lot of wild hogs down in Louisiana, some of which are not native to the area. A lot of people with little, hunting leases brought some over. We have like some Russian boars out there, and a lot of the fences have been knocked down, from like hurricanes and things like that. And so you have like Russian boars and things like that running wild in that area because people couldn't keep them contained. And I've had friends who were just completely baffled by the fact that these large pigs can walk out of the bushes 15 or 20 feet away, cross the tracks, and disappear on the other side and never make a sound. It's nothing supernatural. It's just that most animals, like with the exception of turkeys, don't make noise when they move, and things that are predatory certainly don't make noise, not unless they want to.
My dad used to say, you'll never hear a bobcat coming, or you'll never hear a mountain lion coming. By the time it's there, it's either on top of you or you're in a really bad position, but you'll never hear it coming.
Right. The few people who do hear a mountain lion are people out in California who get attacked while they're riding their bike. They hear toenails on the pavement a split second before they get hit. That's the only time you'll hear them. Predators, most animals, but predators especially, they're very silent. And if a person isn't experienced with wild animals, a person who hasn't spent, a great portion of their life backpacking, hunting, things like that, I could see where they would think that that's supernatural. And the ability to just vanish into the woods, it can seem supernatural. I mean, I'd like to take you out in a canoe one day to some of the swamps and watch a 14-foot alligator vanish in 14 inches of water. I've seen it, and they do it without a ripple. I've seen them slide off the bank, they go under, and in 2 seconds, the water is as smooth as glass. And then they pop up on the other side of your boat, and you realize that they just swam inches beneath you. And you have no idea how they did it because you can, the water isn't that clear in Louisiana, but when the water's only 2 feet deep, you can see to the bottom. And when something that is 2.5, 3 feet wide in the middle swims beneath you, you should be able to see that, but you don't, and I've had that experience with a 14-foot gator that swam beneath my canoe in water that was
my top 5 experiences never to have.
Yeah, and it's just, and it could seem supernatural, but it's because we're not made to do that. We're made to sit in offices and play on iPhones. That's what we've adapted to, and it takes a lot of time out in the woods to acclimate your senses to it so that you can hear and see and smell things that 99% of the population misses.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just glad that both of your experiences are relatively calm. Even the first one, I think, could have gone bad really quick. I'm just glad that both experiences went, for the most part, okay. And it is a real eye-opener. You go from unicorns to leprechauns, like you said in the beginning, to holy crap, these things are real. They're unpredictable. You never know what they're going to do. They may turn and attack you, or they may not. They may try and calculate what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And who knows, with your body language when you're reaching for the knife, it may have decided at that point it wasn't worth the fight and to back off. And I'm just glad that in your situation it didn't go bad and you were able to come on and share it with the audience. So thank you so much for coming on tonight.
You're welcome, man. Yeah, it was it's kind of a relief to be able to tell the whole story, you know, without having to sit someone down and, you know, get a couple beers in them.
Yeah, no, I believe you. It's one of those things, like I always say, it's all fun and games until you run into them, and then you have a whole different mental outlook on what's out there, what's not out there, what you could potentially run into. It kind of opens your eyes really on what's actually out there. Well, I appreciate you coming on, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to share the encounter.
Yeah, hey, thank you for, you know, running such a great show. Actually, I think I listened to 2 or 3 episodes earlier today while I was driving. I'm almost caught up, so I have to go and listen to a lot of the older back episodes now.
I appreciate it, Jason. Thank you so much. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. Wes@SasquatchChronicles.com. Until next time, everyone, have a great night.